The focus of this lecture will be on photosynthesis. We've already talked about how you can take organic compounds such as sugar and break them down and transfer that energy into the regeneration of ATP. But what we're going to talk about now is how some organisms can take gas from the atmosphere and fix that gas to form organic molecules. Now, what you are as a human being is something called a heterotroph, and we have to eat in order to obtain our organic molecules, and then we break down those organic molecules and transfer the energy from those molecules in order to power all of our cellular reactions. So if you are a heterotroph, you are in some way dependent on autotrophs, either directly or indirectly, for your source of energy. We are the consumers of the biosphere. So the focus of this lecture will be on organisms that are able to use energy from the sun in order to produce organic molecules, and these are called the autotrophs. So they are able to convert carbon dioxide, and the ones that we're going to mostly focus on here is going to be the photoautotrophs. These are the ones that can capture the light energy and then transfer that light energy into chemical energy. There are other types of autotrophs on this planet, specifically the chemoautotrophs, and they are able to oxidize inorganic substances for energy. But as I said, we were not going to be covering this aspect of autotrophs. So whereas heterotrophs are the consumers in the biosphere, autotrophs are the producers in the biosphere. So photosynthesis is a process where plants and other photosynthetic organisms can take solar energy from the sun. Now the sun has a tremendous amount of energy that is emitted, and these organisms are able to take this energy and they convert it to a useful form of energy, which is chemical energy. Initially, the product that will be produced is sugar, but then they can take that sugar and they can convert it into all of the organic molecules that are found in these organisms. So in this process of this conversion of solar energy to chemical energy, the gas that is required is carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide is going to be reduced to glucose, and that's what's shown here. So this process is an oxidation reduction reaction where first carbon dioxide is reduced to sugar, but then along with that, water is going to be oxidized to oxygen. And so that's what's shown here is that oxidation of water. So unlike respiration, which we went over in the previous chapter, in which we're taking foodstuffs such as sugar and oxidizing it to carbon dioxide in a process that requires oxygen, this is the reverse of that process, where you're taking carbon dioxide, an atmospheric gas, and reducing it to sugar, in the process is going to release oxygen. Okay, so where is the location of photosynthesis in eukaryotic organisms? Okay, as I mentioned before, it does occur in the chloroplasts, and there are specific cells that are specialized for photosynthesis and are packed full of these chloroplasts. It's usually found in what are called the mesophyll cells. Now, this is a layer on the photosynthetic organs of plants, specifically the leaf, which is more towards the surface, so it's able to capture that solar energy, and then that captured solar energy will be transferred to chemical energy. So the photosynthetic pigment that is found in plants is called chlorophyll. And chlorophyll is a molecule that has an area that is going to be able to absorb the light, but it also needs to be embedded in the chloroplast. And where it is anchored in the chloroplast, this green pigment is anchored in the chloroplast, is the thylakoid membrane. And it is by virtue of a hydrocarbon tail, which is highly hydrophobic, and that allows it to be anchored into the hydrophobic part of this membrane. Now, a stack of thylakoids inside the chloroplast make up something called the grana. So each chloroplast is just filled with these stacks of grana. The grana is composed of these membranes, and these membranes are just loaded with chlorophyll. All right, well, let's take a moment to review chloroplast structure. Chloroplasts have three sets of membranes. There is the outer membrane, and this is closely associated then with the inner membrane. And within the chloroplast are the thylakoid membranes, and this is where we have just reviewed is this location where chlorophyll is located. Now, having three membranes is going to result in having three spaces. So the space between the outer membrane and the inner membrane is called the intermembrane space, inter meaning between. There is the fluid in which the thylakoids are suspended, all this fluid all around here, and this is called the stroma. And we'll be talking about some of the reactions of photosynthesis that occur in the stroma. And then finally there is the space that's inside of these thylakoids, and this is simply referred to as the thylakoid space. Okay, let's do a tally and see where does the carbon in the carbon dioxide go in this process of photosynthesis, and where does the oxygen come from? You know, initially you look at the reactants and the products, and you may think that the carbon goes into the sugar, which actually is correct, but then that the oxygen actually comes from the carbon dioxide, and it actually turns out that this is incorrect. So let's take a look at this one step at a time. Carbon dioxide is reduced to sugar or glucose. So if we were to follow this, here's the 6 carbons in carbon dioxide, and all of those 6 carbons then are in the product glucose of photosynthesis. Now, if we were to say then where does the oxygen come from, right? Where does the oxygen come from? The oxygen comes from the water. So the water here, which is split during this process of photosynthesis, and we'll talk about where in just a moment, is going to be the source of the oxygen gas. All right, so when we study photosynthesis, there are actually 2 stages of photosynthesis. One stage requires light, and this is what we call the light reactions because they require light. And this is the photo part of the photosynthesis. But there is also a part of photosynthesis that does not require light. It can happen in the light, it can happen in the dark. It can happen anytime. And this is what is called the Calvin cycle. And the Calvin cycle is going to involve taking the products of photosynthesis, that is the ATP and the NADPH, which is a molecule very similar to NADH, which you learned about in cellular respiration. And this is the part that uses those high energy molecules to drive the fixation of carbon. So the Calvin cycle is the synthesis part of photosynthesis. So if you were to take a look at this chloroplast, the light reactions are going to occur here in the thylakoids, and then the Calvin cycle we're going to discuss happens in the stroma. So let's first start with the light reactions. So the light reactions, as I mentioned before, require light. And it also requires chlorophyll because chlorophyll is what is going to absorb that light. And recall that it occurs in the thylakoid membranes. So what is going to happen in the light reactions is the light is absorbed, and as light is absorbed, we're going to talk about that electrons are going to be excited as part of that process. Those electrons actually come from water, and so the water is going to be split into oxygen. So the product oxygen actually occurs along the thylakoids during the light reactions. Now, during this process of the reactions, ADP is going to be phosphorylated to form ATP. So you've seen phosphorylation of ADP to make ATP during respiration. And to power that formation of ATP, we had the oxidation of glucose powered that formation of ATP. Well, in photosynthesis, it requires a great deal of energy, and that energy ultimately can only be understood by the cell in the form of ATP. So instead of using glucose to power the formation of ATP, which would be counterproductive in this case, this is the energy from the sun is going to be used to make the ATP, something called photophosphorylation. In addition to that, NADP+, which is a molecule very analogous to NAD+, will now be reduced to NADPH. So the light that is emitted from the sun is now going to be captured by these thylakoids, the chlorophyll and the thylakoids. And the actual light that's being absorbed are the photons. So light is quantized into these little packets of light. And there are when white light is broken up into its component wavelengths, there's actually many different wavelengths. This is the Roy G. Biv, which we'll go over in a moment, red, orange, yellow, blue, indigo, and violet light. So the plants are going to have a variety of photosynthetic pigments in order to absorb as much of this spectrum of light as possible. So chlorophyll actually has three different kinds of pigment. It has chlorophyll A, it has chlorophyll B, and it also has a number of accessory pigments called the carotenoids. And in fact, in fall, when the chlorophyll gets broken down when the leaves die, it is the carotenoids that give the leaves the beautiful oranges and the red color that we associate with fall. So the plants aren't able to absorb all of the light. They're able to absorb most of it. They can absorb everything but green. And this is why plants appear green to our eyes, because this is the wavelength of light that cannot be absorbed by the plant. So this is now the visible light spectrum. And the longest wavelengths of light are in the red region. The shortest wavelengths of visible light are in the violet region. And so you're familiar with these from lab, for example, because a spectrophotometer will take this white light spectrum and it will break it down into its components with the prism, and you select the particular wavelength of light in your spectrophotometer. Now plants also are just going to be using visible light, and it is going to go from 380 nanometers in wavelength to 750 nanometers in wavelength. And just to recall the main component colors of visible light, there is violet, indigo, blue, green, yellow, orange, and red. And backwards this reads Roy G. Biv, and many of you may have learned that shorthand for it in grade school or in high school. So the different the different pigments that are going to be found in a leaf are going to work together in order to absorb almost all of the various wavelengths of white light. There is chlorophyll A, and chlorophyll A is going to absorb in the violet and red range. So let's take a look at this graph showing the absorption spectrum of the three major photosynthetic pigments that are found in leaves. You can see chlorophyll A is going to peak here. This is the violet range, around between 400 and 500 nanometers. But it also has a second peak, and this peak is more towards the red range. So chlorophyll A is responsible for absorbing the light in the violet range and in the red range. Now chlorophyll B is going to absorb at a slightly different location. Chlorophyll B is going to absorb in the violet-blue range. You can see it's a slightly longer wavelength of light for the first peak for chlorophyll B. And then it also has another peak that is going to be a little bit shorter wavelength than what chlorophyll A can absorb. So it gets into that red-orange wavelength of light. Lastly, the accessory pigments, the carotenoids, they are going to be able to absorb violet and blue-green light. And you can see sort of the various peaks here with the carotenoids. There's a little bit here and in the violet range. There's a little bit here in the blue range and a little bit here in the blue-green range. So they're able to absorb a variety of different wavelengths. I want you to see what's covered. So all the way here from violet all the way to blue-green is going to be absorbed by these three pigments, chlorophyll A, B, and the carotenoids. Then there's a break in absorption coverage, and this is going to correspond to mostly what we see as green. And then the end of the spectrum, when you're looking at the reds and the oranges, is also going to be absorbed by these pigments. So we're going to be just focusing on chlorophyll, and chlorophyll is the light absorbing pigment, as we mentioned before, and it is composed of some major parts. So right here, this is what is called the porphyrin ring. That is the light absorbing head of the chlorophyll molecule. And I want you to notice that there's a little magnesium ion that's chelated here in the center of this porphyrin ring. And this magnesium is an important part of the structure and the ability of this chlorophyll to be able to absorb the photons. Now, so how is it embedded in the thylakoid membrane? That's going to be with this very hydrophobic hydrocarbon tail, and that will anchor it into the thylakoid membrane. Now, there are two kinds of chlorophyll. There's chlorophyll A and there's chlorophyll B. And it turns out the difference between these two chlorophylls has to do with what functional group is located in this area of the porphyrin ring. It is a methyl group for chlorophyll A, and it is going to be an aldehyde group for chlorophyll B. And that shifts the absorption spectrum just enough that with the combination of those two chlorophylls, this plant is able to absorb much more of the white light than either one of them alone. So let's take a look at a space-filling model of this chlorophyll. And you can see the head region right here, and I'm pointing to the magnesium ion that's at the center. And then this straight area right here is that hydrocarbon tail that embeds it in the thylakoid membranes. So how is chlorophyll, how is it able to actually absorb the light and transfer it into something it can use? Now, when electrons are energized, they can fall back down to their lower energy state. And oftentimes, this is what you will see with the release of heat from those electrons as the energy is lost, or it's what you see in fluorescence when an electron goes from a higher level of excitement to a lower level excitement. But in photosynthesis, the goal is to harvest this energy and to use this energy to drive the formation of ATP from the phosphorylation of ADP. So let's take a look at the chlorophyll molecule, and this is going to be the ground state in terms of its energy. The photons from the sun are going to hit these chlorophyll molecules, and it's going to excite those chlorophyll molecules. And when it excites the chlorophyll molecules, the electrons will absorb that energy and be brought to a higher energy state. These electrons are said to be in their excited state. Now, when the electrons then lose that energy and go back down, as I mentioned before, they could lose it as heat, and they could lose it and have emission of light and fluorescence. But that is not what is going to happen in photosynthesis. Let's take a look and see what happens. So the goal is to use the energy, not to lose it, to capture it and transfer it in the form of chemical energy and not lose it all in just by heat and or fluorescence. So chlorophyll is actually a very organized structure, and many chlorophyll molecules are organized into groupings, which are called photosystems. And a photosystem is composed of uh, these groups of chlorophylls and the accessory proteins that are going to allow the efficient absorption and transfer of the energy from the photons. So let's get our bearings here. This complex shown in this figure is an example of how your book demonstrates a photosystem. Note that it shows that it is embedded in the thylakoid membranes, and it's showing that photons are now hitting this photosystem. The electrons that are going to be initially excited are going to be a part of the light harvesting complex of the photosystem. And they absorb and funnel the energy from the light that they are absorbing to a central chlorophyll molecule called the reaction center. So it is only the reaction center that is actually capable of releasing and letting go of excited electrons. All the light harvesting part of this molecule, all of that is involved with just absorbing all the light and then funneling it all to the reaction center. And then that reaction center is going to be able to donate electrons that are high energy in consequences of the absorption of that solar radiation. Okay, so let's take a look at the photosystems. First of all, this is just showing to give you an idea of what these photosystems look like. This is again in the thylakoid membrane. You can see that a lot of this is now, this is the thylakoid space, and it is this conglomeration of proteins that set up the photosystem, as well as the chlorophyll molecules that are embedded into it. There are two photosystems. The first that we'll be discussing is actually called photosystem 2. And even though it acts first, it is considered to be the second photosystem. It acts first in the light reactions. That's the part of photosynthesis that requires energy from the sun. And it is going to have a reaction center that is named after its optimal wavelength, in this case 680 nanometers. So the photosystem 2 reaction center is identified as P680. Now there's going to be some aspects of photosynthesis that will continue, but then there will be another photosystem involved, which is called photosystem 1. And this actually acts after photosystem 2, which I know is confusing, but I think you guys can deal with this. So it has a reaction center whose peak absorption is a slightly different wavelength. And so it's differentiated from photosystem 1 by its peak absorption, and it is called the P700. So in review, photosystem 2 comes first, and its reaction center is referred to as the P680. And photosystem 2 acts second in the reactions, and it has a reaction center which we refer to as the P700. To give you a brief overview of the light reactions, I'll first discuss photosystem 2. And the location of photosystem 2 is located in the thylakoid membrane. We'll then talk about the electron transport chain, and that's going to involve a series of proteins that's also embedded in the thylakoid membrane. Talk about the phosphorylation of ATP, or of ADP to make ATP, and that is a process that also occurs in the thylakoid membranes. Then we'll discuss photosystem 1, and photosystem 1 also occurs in the thylakoid membranes. And then we'll discuss the brief role of ferredoxin, which is right here. And then finally, NADP reductase, which is the enzyme on the thylakoid membranes that's responsible for the production of NADPH by the reduction of NADP+. So photosystem 2 is where it all begins. And what you have is the light that these photons from the sun, and that energy is being transferred from chlorophyll molecule to chlorophyll molecule within this photosystem. These chlorophylls will then funnel that energy to its reaction center, which we call the P680. Now, the P680 is going to get excited. And when it gets excited, it is going to release a pair of electrons. Now, that means that this reaction center has lost electrons to something, and it now needs to get those electrons back. And it is going to actually take those electrons back by splitting water. And when water is split, or when water loses its electrons, in other words, when it is oxidized, it is going to be split and produce oxygen gas. So the oxygen that is formed in photosynthesis, this oxygen which we are all so dependent on as aerobic organisms for our cellular respiration, is produced as a byproduct of photosynthesis. The oxygen itself that is produced by these plants is not used in the photosynthetic process at all. It will be used by the plant in its mitochondria for its own cellular respiration, but it is not used for any subsequent reactions in photosynthesis. It is formed solely because this reaction center, P680, requires a replacement of its lost electrons that are released due to the energy that is transferred to it from these chlorophylls in the reaction center, and it gets replaced by the oxidation of water. Okay, so the second part of this process is the electron transport chain. This is a miniature version of what you learned in cellular respiration. There, the electron transport chain received its electrons from the molecules NADH and from the molecule FADH2. Now, this one is different. It receives its electrons from photosystem 2. So these high energy electrons released from photosystem 2 are going to travel through this electron transport chain. And this electron transport chain is going to include a cytochrome complex, which is right here, and is in the thylakoid membrane. And then there are going to be two electron shuttles that are going to be involved with this, called PQ and PC. And these electron shuttles are the electron carriers. So PQ is going to take the electrons from photosystem 2, and it will shuttle them to the cytochrome complex. And this complex is going to pump protons or hydrogen ions into the thylakoid space, and that will cause this gradient, right? This proton gradient across the thylakoid membranes. And then the electrons then will be transferred to PC, and this PC is going to take the electrons to the next point in this process. So meanwhile, because you have this proton gradient, you can have phosphorylation of ATP that's going to happen. But because the phosphorylation isn't due to chemical means like it is in cellular respiration, instead the energy from this comes from photons. So we call this photophosphorylation. So the photophosphorylation occurs as the protons that are inside the thylakoid space are allowed to go along their concentration gradient into the stroma through an ATP synthase. And that ATP synthase, so here's the stroma, that ATP synthase will then drive the phosphorylation of ADP in an inorganic phosphate to make ATP. Now, this ATP is going to be required energy for the Calvin cycle. And this is the location where you have this energy from the sun, these photons from the sun, the solar energy. It is now converted into chemical energy that can be used by the cell for a wide variety of processes. That is this general energy currency that is ATP. Now, as the electrons are passed through photosystem 1, The electrons have lost energy. So what we're going to do now is return to the part of the chloroplast, which is going to now re-excite those electrons. So the electrons are going to now be passed, this is from the electron carriers, are going to be passed to another photosystem. This is photosystem 1. These electrons have lost energy because they were used to pump the protons in that cytochrome complex. So this is an area where the electrons can get they can reabsorb some of the light energy. So the electrons in the center of the reaction center of photosystem 1, which is called the P700. The light is going to hit all of these chlorophylls in the photosystem, the light harvesting complex, and then it will transfer that energy to this reaction center P700, and it's going to take the electrons that it received, right? It was reduced when it accepted those electrons, and then it is going to release those high energy electrons, becoming oxidized again, and those excited electrons are then going to go on to the next step. So again, this requires light, and the end product is you're going to get a re-excitation of these electrons. So this is a schematic of what's happened in between the two photosystems and photophosphorylation. So we're going to start with the light. This is photosystem 2, and the photosystem 2 is going to absorb the light. And this absorbed light will be used to have that photosystem's reaction center release electrons that have been energized. The energy from these electrons are going to be used to produce ATP. But in the process, the energy in those electrons will decline. And so then you have another system, photosystem 1, which is now going to absorb light from the sun, that's these photons, to re-energize these electrons. And actually they get more energy than they did from photosystem 1. So there's going to be light absorption again. What we're going to now talk about is how is this going to be transferred into a form of chemical energy that can be used by the cell. And what's going to happen is that these electrons will be used to reduce ADP plus to make NADPH, this high energy electron carrier. So this is now going to allow there to be two high energy molecules that can be used to power the Calvin cycle. This is the ATP that was made from the initial light absorption, and then this molecule of NADPH, which is now used that is formed through that second light absorption through photosystem 1. So I'm just going to spend a little time now and talk about just this last segment of the light reactions. So first, the electrons from photosystem 1 that are re-energized will be passed to ferredoxin, which is an iron sulfur protein. In other words, it will accept these electrons and in turn become reduced. So this is the next step in photosynthesis. Then this electron shuttle is going to carry it to the NADP plus reductase. Now this is an enzyme that's on the periphery of the thylakoid membranes, and it is going to get reduced by the ferredoxin. That is, it's going to accept the electrons, and then it will pass those accepted electrons and in turn reduce NADP plus to form NADPH. So you need 2 electrons for each molecule of NADPH. And I just want to remind you that NADPH is an energy carrier, which is very similar to NADH, which we have discussed was one of the 2 electron carriers in cellular respiration. So let's do a quick review of the light reactions. So in the light reactions, we've talked about the absorption of light, the absorption of the photons by the chlorophyll molecules of photosystem 2, that light is funneled to the P680 reaction center, that energy is used to have it release electrons into this process. This P680 then again needs to be reduced and get new electrons. The electrons that it receives comes from the splitting of water. And when water is split, oxygen is released as a byproduct. Next, the electrons are used to power an electron transport chain. The electron transport chain has a proton pump in the cytochrome complex, which makes a proton gradient. The proton gradient is used by an ATP synthase to produce ATP from ADP in an inorganic phosphate. The electron that was used in this pump is then going to be moved to the next photosystem, which is photosystem 1. You have the chlorophyll molecules in this photosystem that are absorbing and transferring the energy to the P700 reaction center. It then releases these same electrons that are now very high energy, even higher than they were before. And these electrons will then be used and shuttled first through ferredoxin, but then the enzyme NADP plus will transfer those electrons, facilitate the reaction to transfer those electrons to NADP plus to make NADPH. So in this process now, we have made some high energy molecules. We have made oxygen, which is not high energy. That's a byproduct, right? So the oxygen is released. But what the cell is going to use for the process of photosynthesis in the next step will be ATP and also NADPH. All right, so that ends the lecture on the light reactions. You should follow this up with the lecture on the Calvin cycle. I recommend before you do that you click on this link. This will take you to a Bioflix animation that will review the light reactions of photosynthesis.